So good evening. Another little poem for you, this time Easter Wings, one of the most famous poems that Herbert ever wrote. It is a pattern poem, and its theme of Easter, of course, is the time when Christ's sacrifice of himself for humanity on the cross was the point when humans were freed from the death which their sins made them deserving of, and allowed them to be united with Christ. So just that's what the Easter idea is doing here. So we have this little question of Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor. Shall we read the poem? Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin. With thee let me combine and feel this day thy victory, for if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. It's a fairly straightforward poem in its message. There's a few images that are worth exploring. I think the thing about this poem is what Herbert does visually and with form. The form of this poem, he takes liberties with line lengths and in a way that actually anticipates the free verse of 300 years after he wrote it. The poem is actually in Iambic Pentameter, Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same. Sorry, it's not Iambic Pentameter, it's written in iambs, decaying more and more till he became most poor. With thee, O let me rise. You can hear the iambs in there, so it's definitely not free verse. But the way he uses lines almost wouldn't really be repeated for another 300 years. It's a little bit like Denial in that use of very short lines to express despair and hopelessness. In terms of imagery, the poem is quite straightforward. Created man in wealth and store means God endowed man with great gifts, a great store of abilities. Though foolishly he lost the same, in other words, man lost those things which God gave him. He decayed more and more, and till he became most poor. You can see in this actually an allusion to the story of the prodigal son, who wasted all of his money that his father had given him and returned shamefaced to his father. With thee, O let me rise, obviously, is fairly straightforward as we can understand it. As larks is an interesting image, because larks are birds which sing, which rise from the earth and sing as they rise up into the sky, and they fly very, very high, and they have a beautiful song. So they're often used as images of souls moving towards heaven. Shakespeare uses the line, larks which sing hymns at heaven's gate. That's Shakespeare. But I think what's interesting is with Herbert's use of it is that the Latin for lark is alauda. That means lark in Latin. And in Latin, lauda is to praise. So there is a pun in the word lark, hidden perhaps from the obvious surface meaning of the word, that actually to let me rise as larks, alauda, praising harmoniously. And of course we know this word harmoniously. It's an image of unification, isn't it, of things being in tune. That's an image that recalls denial in that sense. And sing this day thy victories, the victory over death. So Christ by being humiliated on the cross, won a victory over death. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. And actually, this image of the fall furthering the flight is an important one in... Can I delete? That's my question. Yes, I can. The fall furthering the flight is an important one because recalls the phrase used by St. Augustine of the Felix culpa. If I could write Felix, that would be doing jolly well, wouldn't it? Felix culpa, it is one of those paradoxes of Christian faith, that actually the fall, i.e. the fall from grace, which is something which Herbert's alluding to in all this stuff of losing the same, the fall, though it makes us miserable and poor, actually is a happy thing because it allows God to raise us further. That is the idea of the Felix culpa, the happy fall. So the idea which is being expressed here is that actually because we have fallen so far, God raising us up is actually even better because he raises us all the further because of that. The second stanza begins similar images. My tender age and sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin. What I find fascinating about this poem is that it's a pattern poem, and pattern poems tend to be triumphs of technical skill over genuine artistic feeling. The poet tends to have to work so hard to fit his ideas into some clever pattern to visually represent the idea at the heart of the poem that actually genuine feeling gets lost, words get mangled. What's fascinating about this poem is that it is so personal. My tender age in sorrow to begin, I became most thin. And it's arguable that in this poem, Herbert is very clearly alluding to his own ill health, which dogged him through all his life and meant that he died at such a young age, probably of tuberculosis, which is the image of tuberculosis was called consumption because it looked like it was consuming people. It's sort of eating them up, consuming their whole being. So Herbert here seems to be writing in a really personal way. There's always a very personal quality to Herbert's poetry, but very often it's sort of applicable to a general Christian state, spiritual state. But I find this poem incredibly powerful because despite the technical achievement of writing a poem that looks and sounds good in such an odd form, he actually is writing about the most personal aspects of his own life. Thinness is also in the Bible an image of spiritual desolation, a lack of food. I think the last three lines are really beautiful because we've had singing, and in the second stanza we move to feeling. I find that wonderful that actually it's about an experience, not only that one should be able to sing victories, but feel them, experience their transforming effect. Line 20 is the most difficult line in the poem, and it's worth explaining it so you understand what it means. To imp a wing is a term from falconry, that is, keeping and hunting with birds of prey. And if a bird had damaged its wing, you would imp the wing by taking feathers from a healthy bird's wing and using them, grafting them onto the wing of the bird whose wing was damaged, thereby making the wing healthy and strong again. So if Herbert imps my wing, it means to borrow a feather from the wing of Christ to repair and advance the flight in the sin-damaged Christian. So just to repeat that again, it means to imp my wing is to take, or to imp a wing of a bird is to take a feather from a healthy bird's wing and use it to repair a damaged wing of another bird. So the image that Herbert's offering us here is that he will he's asking Christ to lend him a feather, so to speak, from his healthy wings to mend his own broken wings. And then this affliction here means suffering in the final line. And we have this little question at the heart of the poem. What sort of affliction is it? Is it the affliction of the suffering soul, which takes us back to line 10, because we've fallen so far, we actually have further to fly? Or is it Christ's affliction, Christ's suffering on the cross, will actually raise us? A rather beautiful last line, where I think actually both meanings are appropriate. There's some beautiful criticism about the poem. It's been described as having a harmonious shape which represents the effect of yielding to Christ's grace. And it's a poem that has an ease and beauty suggestive of Christian liberty or the freedom of grace. And so now a quick look at the first edition of the Temple, the 1633 first printing of Herbert's poems. And it's worth noting, actually, in the first printing of them, the poems are presented very differently. This is stanza 1, this is stanza 2 over here, but they are presented, as you can see, looking on the page like wings. Whose wings? Are they angels' wings? You also wonder if they are, some critics have argued that they are also similar to the wings of goddesses of classical mythology. I leave it up to you, actually, to think about which presentation you find more effective. I find this presentation very, very beautiful, perhaps slightly harder to read, but there is, if anyone is interested, great quantities of critical debate about the correct way to present these poems on the page. For ease of printing, most people print them with the lines running horizontally, but the image of them, the words falling down the page, perhaps also evoke the fall itself and this thinness of the poem, which actually is so clearly represented in the heart of the poem. I think is really, really beautiful. So there you are. Here's the original printing, just to show that the poem arguably was presented, well, not arguably, was originally presented in the first printing, looking much more strongly like a pair of wings, also perhaps evoking the cross within this image as well. A little, I feel that that's there in terms of the presentation of it. So there you are, Herbert's Easter Wings.